Hi, everyone, and welcome to the premiere episode of Let's Whine About Supply Chain. This is a brand new quarterly series produced and distributed by Supply Chain Brain and Supply Chain Brain Media. I'm Ralph Henderson, your executive producer. I want to welcome you personally to the show, and I want you to know you should be very proud of yourself for being a part of this show. You are investing in your own professional development. Now, yes, there's a playful nod to wine in the title, but make no mistake, this is a serious show about serious supply chain conversations. We want you to know we're going to be talking about everything from procurement to logistics. We're going to be talking about all things supply chain, and most importantly, the people in supply chain. Let's Whine About Supply Chain was created as a space for supply chain professionals to step away from the presentations and the sales pitches and engage in thoughtful peer-to-peer dialogue about the topics shaping our industry today and tomorrow. Each quarter, we'll explore timely, newsworthy issues impacting global supply chains. Like I said earlier, we're going to do everything from procurement to logistics to tech. Hell, we might even talk about AI, believe it or not. And most importantly, we're going to spend time getting to know the people in this industry, the people behind the ideas. We want them to know and you to know it's the people, the leaders, the thinkers, the practitioners that make the real change in our industry. We have an incentive for you to participate in our conversation, but I'm going to let the host share that with you. Today, our show is sponsored by GEP. GEP empowers global enterprises with AI-powered procurement and supply chain software that drives efficiency, speed, and resilience at scale. Our cloud-native platforms provide end-to-end visibility and intelligent automation across sourcing, contracting, planning, and execution. Used by Fortune 500 and Global 2000 organizations, GEP's solutions unifies teams, streamlines operations, and unlocks measurable value. From cost savings and risk reduction to improved supplier collaboration and stronger bottom line performance. For more information, go to gep.com. Today, we launch our premiere conversation with global terroir and global tenders, decanting the modern procurement mix. Running a global supply chain is a lot like crafting a fine wine. Success depends on the right environment, the right process, and the ability to respond when disruption inevitably arrives, whether that's shifting tariffs, geopolitical pressure, or sudden market change. In today's discussion, we'll explore how procurement has evolved into a complex global balancing act. You'll hear insights on mastering sourcing complexity, navigating macro disruptors, understanding the nearshoring advantage, prioritizing people over platforms, and embracing continuous learning as a competitive advantage. And guiding this conversation is someone exceptionally well suited to do so, and we're very excited to have as our moderator Bart DeMonk. Bart's a globally recognized supply chain strategist, industry advisor, and longtime thought leader. Over the course of Bart's career, he's held leadership roles across global logistics, supply chain technology, and global analyst organizations, helping companies navigate transformation, innovation, and digital change at scale. He brings not only deep expertise, but also a uniquely global perspective, making him the perfect host to lead the conversations that we'll be having throughout this series. Bart will introduce today's guest and guide us through what promises to be a rich and insightful discussion. Bart, welcome. The floor, or should I say, the cellar is yours.
Well, thank you, Ralph, and welcome to the premiere of Let's Wine About Supply Chain, where we bring together wine, supply chain, and the people who run the supply chains. I'm your host, Bart de Monk, and as you can see, I've already popped the cork on a fantastic Cabernet. I hope you have your favorite glass in front of you as we enjoy today's episode together. As Ralph said, running a global supply chain is a lot like making this wine. You need the right terroir. By the way, it's a French word for environment. You need a perfect process and just that little bit of courage to handle unexpected frost during the growing season. Now, today we're pouring ourselves a full glass of strategy as we tackle the evolving world of global procurement. And in a world where buying wine and supply chain services has become a complex web of thousands of suppliers, shifting tariffs. We need to know how to pick the best vintage for our business. So grab your favorite vintage and let's get started as we've got a lot to unpack. Now, today, our special guest is Carl Mount, Chief Supply Chain Officer of Jack in a Box. Carl, welcome.
Thanks, Bart. Let me pour my glass while I'm catching up here.
Please do. Now, Carl, I want to start with decanting your career. And you've worked for a lot of different companies that our audience will recognize and probably are even customers of. We're talking about restaurant chains like Yum Brands, Jack in the Box, and Starbucks. Now, what I'm curious to know, Carl, how did you get into supply chain and how did you get from your early start to your current role as Chief Supply Chain Officer? And I'm sure you had to crush some grapes along the way.
I sure did, and I crushed them all over the place. Hey, but before I got into what was typically called food service or fast casual or QSR, which is kind of the restaurants that I've worked for, I actually started in the CPG world, so consumer goods. Right out of college, I interviewed on campus with Pepsi. Went to work for PepsiCo in their management training program. It wasn't called supply chain back then. It was either transportation or procurement or maybe warehousing. And PepsiCo was a great place to kind of grow up in my early years. They made it conscious decision to start me in kind of the transportation logistics side. 5 years in, I moved into manufacturing. I didn't actually move into procurement till after PepsiCo, but that was a great starting place. Then I leaped overseas with the Coca-Cola company. So big competitors, but moved over to Turkey in my early 30s with my, at that point, 1 year of marriage with my new wife. Lived halfway across the world and built international supply chains, logistics, and manufacturing facilities. Then got my MBA, came back to the US, got my MBA, and then jumped into consulting. Consulting was kind of opening the doors to lots of other things, and then on to Yum Brands and certainly, Starbucks. Yum Brands was a great opportunity to go overseas again. I didn't live overseas, but controlled the real supply chain connections for all of the international business units for Yum Brands around the world. Starbucks was all about command and control, really North America, some in international manufacturing as well, but mostly company-owned stores. And then Jack in the Box, much smaller companies, but bigger fish, smaller pond, those kind of things. So certainly, I'm one that has not stayed at one job my whole career, but continuously kind of moving up the ladder, broadening it, getting outside my comfort zone in terms of different functions within supply chain, because we all know supply chain is pretty broad. It's not just one area.
Yeah, that's great, Carl. And I know we share some of the background. I spent 10 years myself at PepsiCo and have a bit of an international experience as well. Obviously, coming from Europe, right? Originally from Belgium, having worked in Australia and England, and now been since 23 years here in the US, in Texas. And I'm a proud Texan and proud Belgian American citizen. Now, for the audience, stay tuned for the live Q&A because the best audience questions will win a free bottle of wine. And this is going to be the same wine that we're going to be drinking or we're already drinking during this show. So with that, Carl, let's double back to the wine we uncorked earlier. See what I did there, Carl? And
I
no,
did.
it isn't the Jack in the Box wine. Funny story. There is a Jack in a Box wine brand from Bendigo, Australia, but that's not what we're going to be drinking today. Carl, you went ahead and picked a really nice bottle of wine for this episode, right? Our inaugural episode. And one lucky audience member will win that bottle of wine. Carl, I know this wine has a special meaning to you. So, what is this wine that we're drinking? And why is this wine so special to you?
So actually, when Bart asked me to be on the show, and you can see the label there, the double back label, I wasn't sure if Bart knew the wine or not because it's been in my cellar for a good number of years. But it's not necessarily from a Napa or some of the best known American or California terroirs. But so Doubleback is from Walla Walla, Washington. So if you know Washington, this is far east Washington, Columbia Valley. My daughter went to undergrad in Walla Walla at a university there 4 years, and I was introduced to Doubleback while we were there. We ended up we were living in Seattle with Starbucks. We'd go out there often to visit her, but Doubleback is actually owned, if you are a football fan, by a famous quarterback, Drew Bledsoe. Drew went to college in Washington at Washington State, then went on to play for the Patriots prior to retiring. And the Doubleback name comes from him doubling back to where he went to high school in Walla Walla, Washington. So that's where that is, and it is it's just a fabulous. It's a high end wine. It's not not inexpensive, but I got way too much of it in my cellar.
Yeah, it's great. And, Drew was actually quarterback here in Texas as well for the Dallas Cowboys. And just like he got replaced by a guy called Tom Brady at the Patriots, we had a guy, Tony Romo, that took his place. But
Yep.
we're kind of happy about it because now he's making this great wine. And I've had the great pleasure myself to visit Walla Walla and some other parts in Washington State. And Carl, I didn't know about these wines from the region until about 2008. So like I said, I've been in the US since end of 2003. I really wasn't even aware that they made wines in Washington State until I took the family on an Alaska cruise and had a bottle of Licol 41 on the cruise ship. I know you know it as well. I've actually got my
Yep.
Licol 41, which is another French word, Licol. It means the school. And I remember coming home and researching Walla Walla and all its great wines. And of course, Walla Walla, it has a ring to it, right? So for the audience, the name Walla Walla is actually derived from the Walla Walla tribe who traditionally inhabited the valley. It's a Sahaptin, it's Native American word that most commonly translates to place of many waters or many waters. Reminds you a little bit of supply chains and all the ports. And the word is considered onomatopic, which kind of intends to mimic the sound of water rippling over stones or flowing in a stream. Well, if that doesn't get you kind of thirsty for a glass of wine, I don't know what does. But the wine and sipping the wine, Carl, actually makes me a little bit hungry. So let's switch topics from wine to food and talk about Jack in the Box. And I know the company has been around for over 75 years. Can you give us a little history about Jack in the Box and kind of bring it from that rich history all the way to 2026?
Yeah, so Jack is in its 75th anniversary. This year we're celebrating actually, and it was founded outside of San Diego, in a little town called El Cajon. But it was really known early on. If you think about, a lot of drive-throughs right now are testing AI, and how does generative AI take your order at the drive-through? Well, Jack in the Box, interestingly enough, had the very first drive-through and the little speaker phone and things. You would normally drive it up to a window to a person, but Jack created the first speaker phone with the menu and things like that. If you saw pictures of it, it was inside the clown head. So Jack's head was who you were speaking to. Famous for its burgers, but also famous for its fried tacos. So interestingly enough, we're a burger joint, but we sell more fried tacos on a unit count basis than we do burgers. It's our highest volume item. It's also big time known for late night. So some of the commercials maybe a decade ago were a little leaning towards maybe you were a little altered mindset when you were going to Jack, and I can't admit or not admit that might have been the case with me in college a few times to Jack in the Box, whether it was alcohol or other substances. It was always fun to hit Jack in the Box at midnight, 2 o'clock in the morning when you're getting out. 24/7. Most of our stores are West Coast based, but broad, diverse menu, and certainly, attract 24-hour breakfast as well. So if you haven't been one lately, give us a try.
Yeah, that sounds good. And I know I love the breakfast, besides all the other stuff that we have. So if as we mentioned before, right, wineries are going a little bit through challenging times because of changing consumer demand. We see change in wine drinkers, etc., weather-related impacts and things like labor regulations, etc. But at the same time, they're continuously looking into new technologies to automate the wine harvesting, to improve winemaking process, and to delight the customer more. So we see a lot of changes in that. Carl, does that sound anything like your business? Any impacts, any headwinds, tailwinds you see that are making maybe your life as a business a little bit more complex in 2026?
Well, let's talk headwinds. Certainly, I think there's headwinds that have just come up the last few weeks. I'll get to those, but headwinds that have been hitting our industry, which is QSR, quick service restaurants, for a couple of years. Being primarily West Coast based, anybody in California knows lots of labor challenges over the last couple of years, and a lot of those were legislative in nature in terms of minimum wage increases, those kind of things. So the biggest two line items on any restaurant are, one, cost of goods sold, so your ingredients cost, and your second line item, usually just a few percent less, is labor. Those two things combined, might make up between 50 and 60% of your cost, your middle of the P&L. So that headwind's been going on. I'll tell you, this year in particular, but it's been going on for a couple of years. And if you read the regular headlines, beef prices, we're primarily a burger joint. So like McDonald's, like Wendy's, like Burger King, inflation in beef has been a huge headwind. And then to every single restaurant or agricultural business, our latest headwind is the volatility of oil. If you look at the price of diesel fuel, it's going to be $7 easy in California this week. And on average, it's probably hitting the 5.5s and 6s, in a lot of other states as well. And so every single tractor on a farm, every single ability to transport food from factory to, from farm to factory to DC to then to us, is carried on a truck, most likely in the domestic, U.S. market. And all of that's got fuel surcharges attached. So headwinds are big. I think, tailwinds certainly are there, and we're working with our suppliers on automation, on AI abilities to help forecast a little bit better, give them advance notice on what we think our spikes are going to be, those kinds of things. So the tailwinds are there, but right now the headwinds are certainly outranking the tailwinds a little bit.
Yeah, and I know, Carl, I think when we had our prep call a couple of weeks back, I think you mentioned that just that day, one of your big suppliers of meat, and where the meat got butchered and everything, went on strike. So you guys are confronted with things that hit you like almost at a moment's notice. How do you continuously kind of wrap your mind around all these different things? And how do you, specifically you in your role as leading the supply chain, how do you deal with those things on a daily basis?
Yeah, so that specific supplier is a big beef processor in Colorado. They're actually the biggest beef processor in the country, actually internationally owned. And we had about a week's notice that this strike was really going to happen. And like any other industry, one incident changes the resiliency and the dynamic of the full market. So with that, just because one facility goes on strike doesn't mean everybody else's prices stay low and that one goes up because of lack of supply. It actually floats all boats. So I think the biggest thing that we do, and we've been doing this long before I've been at Jack in the Box, is you got to diversify supply. So domestic beef is at an all-time high for domestic beef. You go to the store, you want to buy a prime rib, a steak, whatever the case might be, you're paying a hell of a lot more per pound than you were even 3-4 years ago. So the same thing works in the QSR business. We buy it at wholesale. We get the opportunity to decide what kind of fat blends we want in our burgers, those kind of things. So not only are we using domestic supply, which is its highest point, but we also have the opportunity to import. The challenging piece over the last year is every one of our import markets have been hit with a tariff at some point in time, and trying to judge whether that tariff is going to be 15%, whether that tariff is going to be 0 because of USMCA with Mexico and Canada, whether that tariff gets bumped up from 15% to 50%, because all of a sudden Brazil coffee and beef got bumped up. And so that diversification works sometimes, and other times you're scrambling and diversifying one way this week, and then a month later, based on tariff changes, diversifying again. And then being able to then assess those suppliers, qualify those suppliers, make sure that we do all the food safety and quality inspections in advance with all these shifting diversifications. So all that is really, really dynamic and moving at a fairly fast pace these days.
Yeah, I think that's a big challenge I see across supply chain, right? Two main things you mentioned. Supply diversification is a top strategy companies are using. The other part is increasing inventory. And
Yep,
while that might help with risk, it also drives up complexity and it also increases supply chain costs. So again, this year, even before we were hitting the high fuel costs, we're already expecting supply chain costs and especially logistics costs to go up. Higher
absolutely.
inventories mean higher inventory holding costs, but also transportation costs and rates on the rise. Now, when we talk about procurement, right, and that has its own challenges, especially as you mentioned, you're buying fresh produce, you're buying beef coming from multiple regions, and we've also seen the last few years a lot of increasing food safety and regulations. Now, is that a big concern as well? All those regulations and how you keep up with that and track the beef, or has technology already solved all of those headaches, Carl?
I don't think it's solved them all. I think we are all on a journey on it. I mean, there's the best the the most straightforward traceability and transparency is approve a supplier or 10 suppliers, and you have complete control of that product from the time it leaves that source plant till the time it arrives at your DCs and your restaurants. And so, the industry has used that a lot, especially on things like beef, because you can have really strong coding on cases. You have production dates and kill dates and all those sorts of things. I think the area that we are challenged with the most in industry, in the food beverage industry, is traceability of things like produce. Produce, it's much harder to keep traceability by lots on farms, and if you're buying from, right, instead of directly from the grower, you're buying from a co-op, or you're buying from somebody that combines different growers together. And traceability's come a long ways, but there's still more to go. And I think you, Bart, probably have heard about FSMA 204, which is kind of the government's approach to doing it. But I would tell you, as an industry, we've self-regulated more than that. We started playing, not only with G10s and coding that way, but then we haven't a Jack in the Box, but some played with RFID, some have played with other methods, and the balance between paying for RFID tags and traceability through G10s or other methods. You're always trying to figure out what's the best ability to do that. But we're all on a journey with that, and I think the journey is in different places. But it takes a village. It's the producers, it's the growers, it's the distribution centers, and it's the restaurant chains all together in that business.
Yeah, so now lately we've been obviously when it comes to procurement, right? We talked about having suppliers, different suppliers, but maybe switching suppliers to different locations, things like nearshoring. I was just in Mexico City at a large event last week, and obviously we see the impacts there on Mexico with manufacturing volumes going up. Is that something you see as well at Jack in the Box? And how does all of that impact the supply chain at a larger scale?
So I would tell you that the actual food supply chain, for the most part in North America, is fairly short. So it's really intertied between Canada, U.S., and Mexico, and we operated, but before the threats of tariffs this past year, we operated fairly borderless between Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. because the growing regions for lettuce moves from the California Central Valley and Central Coast area down to Yuma, Arizona. Farms are on both sides. Things like canola oil are Canadian based. Potatoes are farmed in the Pacific Northwest and in Manitoba, and those areas as well. So those supply chains are fairly short. I think the bigger, longer supply chains where we're looking at nearshoring definitely had to do with consumables, packaging goods, those kind of things that we were willing to tolerate, container shipments and those. And we've moved a lot of those not only to nearshoring in Mexico, maybe some other Central American countries, as far south as maybe some South American countries. But we were also then playing around with, hey, what's the tariff going to be in China versus Indonesia versus Thailand versus India, and those kept shifting on us. So a matter of doing both, both looking at tariff leverage, but as well as just transportation challenges as well that we were having.
Right. And talk about transportation, right? Brings us to a topic, sustainability, right?
Yeah.
And of course, going back to the wine, a lot of wineries and even entire wine regions strive to be sustainable and organic. Actually, the wine that we're drinking here, this beautiful double back cab, is explicitly what they call certified sustainability, right? And all five of Doubleback's estate vineyards are live certified, and it's live, which stands for low input viticulture and enology. And as part of that sustainable commitment, they also adhere to Salmon Safe standard, which focuses on protecting water quality and the habitat even in local watersheds. So talking about sustainability, how in certain industry it becomes bigger and we have regulations, although I think under current administration, maybe there's a little bit less focus on that. Is sustainability a big additional challenge to deal with for you guys on top of all of these other disruptions? What do you think that sustainability means for an organization
It,
that's in food and beverage?
it is, and we're publicly traded, and I think publicly traded companies get that much more, oversight, not oversight from necessarily the government, but from consumers, and we try to be as transparent as we can. And Bart, I would tell you that we talk about it, one level higher than just sustainability, and we really look at ESG, so environment, social, governance, and that encompasses, in addition to the sustainability challenges and commitments that we make, it also involves, our social impact. And those are the kind of two that I own in supply chain. Governance is a little bit more from a legal standpoint and how we track and measure. But I would tell you in an environmental side, we're looking at our packaging inputs. We're looking at how our packaging is recycled. We haven't launched anything at Jack yet, although some others in our industry have launched let's not use one-time, packaging containers, reusables, those kind of things. Starbucks was at the lead edge of a lot of that when I was there, and we were certainly setting up cup exchange programs and those kind of things. So there's the packaging side, but the other piece is on sustainability. It's important is your CO2 emissions. You're really thinking about for phase 2, phase 3 kind of emissions, and how are you doing with those? Water, our usage of water in restaurants, and kind of those ratios are important. But then if you kick over into social impacts, that's where our animal welfare falls in. So for us at Jack in the Box, but even when I was at Yum Brands with KFC, it's about chicken and how it's raised and how it's slaughtered and those things. And a lot of times we're balancing different expectations from different NGOs. They all have specific areas that they focus on, and we have to balance between cage free and pasture fed and all those things. Certainly pork right now, big conversations about OPG, so open pen gestation and those things. And I would say you're originally from Belgium and Europe. Europe is actually further ahead on a lot of these things than we are in the US, and kind of having that balance between industry and consumer expectations.
Yeah. Now, obviously, as you mentioned, right, you guys have big focus on ESG. I'm assuming that sustainability is also a requirement in your procurement process when dealing with suppliers. Is that an important part, and how do you look at suppliers from that sustainability? Because you buy most of the product. So how do
Absolutely.
suppliers take part of that sustainability program?
So we start with the basic of the basics, and that's code of conducts. Every supplier has to meet a specific code of conduct, and we publish what those are. But that's the basics. We also, during RFP processes, during any type of interaction, even our annual and quarterly business reviews, want to sit down and really understand, hey, how are they performing against those? Because that's the upstream that we can help develop and we can help enforce, but we don't have the day-to-day control of that. So from that perspective, be it our dairy suppliers, our beef suppliers, our chicken suppliers, our pork suppliers, our packaging suppliers, just getting down with them and saying, look, in responding to the RFP that we've sent to you, we want you to respond not just to cost, but also to service, environmental resilience, sustainability, those all things kind of go into a full kind of cost benefit analysis as you go out and you score that RFP, like so many of us do. You've got lots of scoring points that go across the balanced scorecard for an RFP submittal.
Yeah. Is that something you drive all the way to transportation as well, looking at maybe carriers that either have, like you mentioned, right, diesel, but maybe not necessarily electric vehicles, but more
Yep.
recent diesel engine, which have a lot less emissions than your older vehicles?
So I would tell you at Jack in the Box, we don't do that now. But when I was at Starbucks, we during the 6 years that I was at Starbucks, we moved the vast majority of our transportation from being managed by external parties to managed internally. So we put in a TMS, transportation management system, Oracle TMS, and we hired a full team, and we were doing about 90% of our transportation tenders and coordination internally. And we did under the leadership of my transportation VP at the time, we did a lot of work on that, and actually got some pretty significant awards. We had electric trucks out there on certain carriers running certain routes that we knew we could get, from point to point, one charge back, one charge. We were doing some things where we were capturing emissions, and then keeping that off the actual, CO2, green gas emissions, and then actually taking those emissions in a cylinder through a startup company, and disposing of it in a different manner than through just CO2 out into the air. So we were doing a lot of cool stuff back kind of when I left Starbucks in the early 20s during the pandemic.
Wow, that's amazing. Now, talking about some of these new technologies, as you mentioned, right? Jack in the Box was an innovator in the industry early on, right? You guys were the first to utilize radio communication for the ordering. And as you mentioned before that, people just had to go direct client to window contact. Now, obviously, that first move into innovation led to great efficiency. Now, how, Carl, do you see technology and things like artificial intelligence today? And how can this be useful for the restaurant's business? Now, specifically when we talk about things like procuring products, quality checks, regulatory compliance, etc.
So I would say, Bart, that I'm not seeing artificial intelligence at this point in our company being used yet for things like quality checks. Um, I think I think that could be into the future, and I'll need to research that. Maybe talk with you a little bit about anything that you might be seeing there. I think that the place that we're really leaning into, on certainly on agentic AI, trying to really say, hey, how can we get, contracts documented faster? How can we use, certain bots and things like that in our, just to free up time, to be quite frank, to allow the teams to be more strategic. Another area that I've been leaning into really, really heavily, because since the pandemic, predicting consumer behavior in QSRs, and even back to my Starbucks days, when were customers coming back? Right now, it's, we all hear about a K-shaped economy, and if you don't know, if the audience doesn't know what a K-shaped economy is people that are earning $100,000 or $200,000 and above are still spending a lot of money. People that are earning less than $100,000 or $50,000 a year, they're spending a lot less money. And so, this ability to predict at a QSR, you're customer facing. So what are they going to come in and order right now? And if you're out of stock, it's not like they're going to go and pick another product necessarily. And so our forecasting abilities in the last, really since the pandemic, have been really challenged. So how do we use the tools in AI and machine learning to be able to better predict those? And there's a huge supply demand balancing act that can help us with. And I think a lot of restaurant companies are deciding, hey, how best to use that. And then use that same information to go back up to suppliers so that they can be, better informed about incoming and inventory and safety stock and all those types of things. So whether it's across contracts, whether it's across just manipulating tactical data analytics on a regular basis, to really those those tools that you need for better forecasting. IoT inputs into it, weather predictions, event predictions, that are going to go into a store getting, a heap of traffic after a music concert one night. Those kinds of things is what we're playing with as much as we can.
Yeah, and I think with being such a big North American brand and having, I think it's over 2,000 stores, something like
Yep,
that, Carl.
that's correct.
You probably even have a lot of regional differences, right? In the way
We do.
people consume. Maybe, like you said, in Texas, we love those fried tacos. I know I've had my fair share. I had a Jack in the Box very close by when I was working in Plano at PepsiCo, and I know I went by there quite a bit. But then maybe in other regions, it might be something completely different. So how often does that change, and how do you look at things like procuring products for specific location or just planning for it, having those that almost that real-time impact of not just overall consumer behavior changing, right?
Yeah.
But also regionally having all these differences.
Yeah, so we're fortunate that so we just put in a brand new point of sale system across all of our stores, and so we get fairly real time input on what actually the sales mix is what we call it. So it's a menu mix. What are customers buying? And you're correct. What we sell in Texas versus what we sell on the East Coast and the Midwest and versus our California stores, that mix is significantly different. So we split up things into mix and day parts, and we get constant feedback. We run with 9 different distribution centers across the country, everywhere from the West Coast to the East Coast, and each of those we put in a different kind of algorithm for what the safety stock needs to be, the holding time of each of our prime movers. If you think about an ABC inventory, those types of things, and then look by exception management, we're managing. Okay, well, what's it looking like based on yesterday's sales to what our inventories are today? So what's our forward coverage? What do we need to focus on? That's a pretty typical inventory management task that my teams are looking at pretty much daily. And then our distributors are too. So we have 3PLs, food service distributors that manage those 9 warehouses for us. But that's a constant struggle between physical inventories, what you sold the last hour, what you sold the last day, versus what's in stock, and then the real work happens then is balancing those out, and how fast can you move them, and get things moved around. Is it coming direct from supplier, or are you having to move it from another inventory location?
Yeah, it's very interesting because I think sometimes people might get the wrong impression that a burger, it's only a limited amount of ingredients. How hard can that supply chain be, right? Until you
Yeah.
look and kind of look behind the veil of the complexity of it. And I think overall, working with food and beverage that has very short shelf life, that has a lot more regulations than other things, it's incredibly complex. And that also really means that you have to have good people, right? And I still think what remains in supply chain is the most important part. And again, I don't think that's going to change anytime soon, not even with the best technology. It's people and the talent that you employ. Now, obviously, you guys employ a lot of people at headquarters, but also a lot of employees at those different franchises. How do you, as an executive in the company, how do you see talent as central to the success of Jack in the Box? And how can you, as a company, continue to attract the best talent for your business? Because we all know that there's competition for talent as the workforce is shrinking. How do you do that? How do you handle that in this day? And again, going forward, people are going to remain that most corner heart of supply chains. So how do you keep getting the best people to come and work for you?
Well, that is always a challenge, and I would tell you in my team, I have kind of a couple of different buckets of types of jobs, if you want to call them that. So we've got what we call program managers, which are really doing a lot of the inventory, and we do lots of what's called limited time offers, which is kind of 8 weeks of what the promo is going to bring you in. We've got category managers that are really sourcing and procuring products, making those deals with all of our suppliers. Then we've got real physical logistics experts as well. On top of that, then certainly our leadership and some analytics as well. So the one thing that we do, I think, and we're getting better at it. We did see a lot of turnover at just after the pandemic, and I think a lot of people in supply chain did. Burnout was a real thing during the pandemic. We saw people leave the industry in food service, people come into the industry. So there was some training that went on at that point in time. That was prior for me getting to Jack in the Box. Sitting down with each of your team members and saying, okay, what's a specific individual development plan for you? Everybody wants to know, what's my next career step? Well, that's always, it's not always linear. It's like maybe you need to move over from planning or being a program manager over into category management for a little bit. Maybe you need to go vice versa. Maybe you need to learn a little bit more about logistics, and the ability to move sideways as well as up is important. And I do think, we've got a relatively small team. We got 30 people in the corporate office that work on supply chain across those different areas. So from that standpoint, it's an ongoing challenge. I would say the last couple of years we've retained the current talent that we had. We did sell off a brand, Bart. We owned Del Taco as well up until December. So there was some anxiety in our company, certainly with, well, what will that mean for the future, just in full honesty? And we've shared that publicly. We lost a couple of people based on that. But I think it's those individual people development conversations that I lean into the most, both with my leaders, and then because it's a small team, just going around rubbing shoulders with folks. So
Yeah.
training and experiences and and personal one-on-one mentoring, all those things can't be done by technology. Those are being done by personal relationship.
Yeah, those are all great insights, and thank you for sharing that, and thank you for being as a leader such an example to people. And I know you go to a lot of conferences as well and educating people and spend a lot of time on that. So I think it's so important. Now that takes us to and Carl, go ahead and have a sip of your wine. That takes us to the point in the conversation where we're going to go to the audience question. And again, keep asking those questions. You do have the opportunity to win a great bottle of wine here. So we have quite a few questions coming at us from a lot of different people. So let's see what is a good one. So one question we have here, the question is, Carl, how do you enable change management to move the organization to, it says specifically an AI environment, yet keep human in the loop as domain expertise is still critical? I think you alluded to that, and I think you were saying that maybe you're not doing a lot of AI, but I think you definitely have been talking about people being central to that. But if you look at it maybe broader, looking at technology and people, right,
Yep.
whether it be AI or something else, how do you as a leader look at that, and how do you make sure that you use that domain expertise and make your employees feel empowered?
Yeah, I think the best example I'll do with that is I'll go back to Starbucks, because we certainly did a lot of tech implementations while I was there. Anybody that knows Project 44, we implemented that. I mentioned already our TMS system. We certainly implemented a lot of different technology and how to work with our logistics providers. I think the number one step that I've always used in change management on that is get the team involved often and early. So building those, whether it's just project management teams, but in addition to that, broader teams of experts that are the ones doing the work, and make sure they have input early on into criteria building on the technology solutions, and then as well get readouts from those project teams that they know what steps are being done at all times. Because the journey is not going to be a couple of weeks journey in most cases. It's going to be, our TMS, it took us, to be quite frank, a couple of years to get fully up on Oracle TMS. And so building their knowledge and their input and their understanding of how that will impact their day-to-day job long before the system actually launches full time was an important piece of the change management. I think everybody on this call knows that certainly they've, the biggest reason for failure for technology is not the technology, it's the change management around the technology. And so that's the biggest advice I can give you, is make sure it's not a surprise to anybody on that team, and that they get involved early and often and help to design, how they're going to interact with that technology.
Right.
That would be the biggest advice I would give. And that's more from Starbucks.
And that's a good point, right? And I think it sounds logical, but yet there's been so many of these technology projects, digital transformations, AI use cases that the last few years have been a complete mess and have failed because people had an over focus on the technology and didn't focus enough on the change management of people. So people need to understand, as you said, Carl, that you need to lay in that foundation of training your people up front, taking them along in that journey and putting the right steps on. So I've got a few more questions in here. Here's a really interesting question. How do you recommend getting future workforce or younger generations excited about careers in supply chain management?
Start them early. Um, I'll tell you, I was just as Bart mentioned, I actually sit on the board of two educational boards for my alma mater. They have a master's in supply chain program, but I also sit on the board of ASU, and they've got a full program in supply chain across undergrad, graduate, and PhD. But together with the undergrad supply chain club at ASU, I went to a high school 2 weeks ago in Phoenix, Arizona, and I talked to a high school class about what we do in supply chain. And the vast majority of high schoolers, maybe until the pandemic, had no clue about supply chain. Maybe in the pandemic, a little bit of a clue. But all we did for 45 minutes to an hour in that class was talk about the day-to-day real aspects of what supply chain is about. And the questions that they asked and the lights that were going off just in that 45 minutes hopefully got them interested if they go to ASU to pick supply chain as possibly their major or their double major or their minor or something. And so it starts there. But then I do think as professionals in our industry, we have to give back. So go to your local colleges that are in your area. If they got a supply chain program, be willing to talk in classes, be willing to go on campus and mentor students, be willing to give back because that's the next generation. And I'm an old guy. I'm 62 right now. I'm not going to be around that long, whether I'm retired or moving on to the next life. But it's important that we have to have people that are as interested in this profession as we are in the future. So that's the best advice I can give you. Get involved in your local educational places to get people fired up.
Yeah, and I think it's thanks to leaders like yourself and mentors in the industry that will also create a lot of interest to come and join this industry. And talking about that, I actually have a question here all the way from England from my mentor early on in supply chain in the 90s when I was working in Europe. And the question coming from him is, do you see any innovation for third-party logistics providers, whether it's technology or clean supply chain providers, or do you tend, as a customer, to dictate to them what they need to do?
That's a good question. I've seen both sides of that coin. Let me just let me leave it there. There are cutting edge logistics providers that come to me with new ideas all the time. Unfortunately, most of the time I don't have an agreement with them or a relationship with them. And I find other 3PLs that are just slow and don't want to change and are caught up in their, the 2 decades ago technology. And it is frustrating because I do think, not only is food and beverage a little bit behind, I think some other industries, but I do think logistics as a whole is behind where they need to be.
Yeah.
So,
And I will say, especially in your industry where it's a lot of cold storage as well, right?
yep,
I know even years ago, a company called Lineage Logistics, right? One of
yep,
the leading cold, where they were using AI, and they were using AI because obviously to chill those warehouses, you need to have a lot of power. And so what they had figured out was an AI algorithm to know when electricity was the cheapest at night, because most of us sleep and don't consume energy, where they were
yep,
chilling it to a certain point and then let it come up throughout the day without ever hitting a point where it went over temperature. And through that, have cold temperature, but having at a lot less cost and a lot less impact on the local network. And this was something they were doing years ago already. So
yep.
some of them, like you said, very advanced, some of them maybe not so much, just like supply chains. We have the leaders, and unfortunately, we also have the laggers. But I think obviously, with some new technologies out there, we only see that accelerating. I have an interesting question here. I'm not sure if we can really answer it, Carl, but I'm going to see if you have a perspective. And the question is, why are larger industries not pushing back harder against tariffs?
Oh, I think we are. Um, I would tell you, so I'm very active in the National Restaurant Association. I actually chair the supply chain committee for the National Restaurant Association, and I can tell you that that whole organization association is lobbying hard. I think one win for us in tariffs in this industry was, if you remember back to April Liberation Day, as President Trump called it. I'm not trying to be political here. There was tariffs on both Canada and Mexico on pretty much all products. And then within a couple of days later, it came out from the administration that they were going to exempt anything that was covered by USMCA. And most of the food products are covered by USMCA. And we were lobbying really, really hard as the NRA for that exemption, and we got it. And so I was thrilled with that. So I do think that the regular media does not report on the amount of lobbying going on. And sometimes I'm concerned that maybe some of the higher profile companies like automotive, like aerospace, like others maybe get a little bit more favorable treatment than us because we're a less sexy industry necessarily, but we are out there lobbying super hard and pushing back.
Right. Very good. Very quickly, last questions for you, Carl. What's your experience today decanting and tasting this great wine? Personal observation on the wine.
So what I love about this wine, you can see here, it's deep red, it's plummy. I like my bold reds. And so this just pairs great with a really good prime steak. A little bit red on the inside of that steak. I'm not going to drink the whole bottle. It's 5 o'clock someplace, but not where I'm at in Palm Springs. So that's what I love about it.
And it's opening nicely. So again, take some time, open a bottle, have it go. So Carl, last part for you. One piece of advice that you have for the audience as they face their own challenges in today's supply chain.
So one on career advice. Hey, you saw from my career, I bounced around companies, but I've also taken risks and stepped out of my comfort zone. And I know a lot of people will tell you that, but in real life, I did it. And I look back and I'm happy I did. Move overseas, take different roles. So do that. Second, when it comes to supply chain, we all thought the pandemic was going to be the most volatile years in the last 5. Think again, we're still going through uncertainty like crazy. Think the last month. So uncertainty is the new certainty.
Yeah, great points, Carl. Thank you so much for joining us today and educating us not only on this great wine, but also in your personal career. And obviously the great insight that you shared on supply chains, more specifically around procurement. And as we taste the last of our glass of Walla Walla Vintage, let this be your final thought. The greatest agility, like the finest wine, requires years of deliberate cultivation. So thank you to our audience for sharing your time and the questions, and thank to our sponsor. And again, can't thank you enough, Carl, for your wisdom. I raise my glass to your resilience. That's all the time we have for this episode. Remember, my friends, in the world of supply chain, the greatest asset is not technology, it's the people that you empower and the knowledge you share. So continue to educate others and continue learning, because every conversation between 2 or more people is an opportunity to learn as well as teach. And I, for one, learned a lot today from our special guest, Carl Mount. So Ralph, back to you.
Thank you so much. You talk about learning. Man, this was fantastic. You guys did a great job. I just want to say thank you so much, especially to the people who viewed today and registered for today's show. I also want to say a special thank you to Bart, our moderator. Bart is the creator of this series and our moderator, and we look forward to Bart, you continuing to take us down this road of talking to people about very important things in the supply chain. Once again, thank you, Carl, to our guest, and thank you to our sponsor. We really appreciate that. Certainly, we always welcome people who want to sponsor our shows. And then remember, you can stay connected with us on LinkedIn at Supply Chain Brain. But also, if you have a question, you want to submit, you've got up to 30 days before Bart's going to select his question of the show and send you a special bottle of today's featured wine. So thank you, everyone. We wish you the very best, and may the next 3 months be your best quarter ever.